was a peace agreement in place after the Second Battle of Dongola in 652. It was an agreement between the Kingdom of Makuria, or al-Maqurra, in what is today southern Egypt and Sudan, and the Rashidun Caliphate that had just conquered Egypt, after which followed a failed attempt at invasion of Makouria, in which the Battle of Dongola was fought. This peace caused by the agreement would last for about 6 centuries, making it one of the longest lasting peace periods in history. The peace agreement was not an exact peace document, and more of a general agreement of non-aggression on both sides. The agreement also included trade, and especially the trading of slaves and tribute in the form of slaves, from Makouria to the Rashidun Caliphate. Slaves that were often brought into Makouria from what was on the other side of Makouria, down south, which was the Empire of Axum, a large empire based in modern-day Ethiopia and surrounding countries, and one of the main rivals of the Rashidun Caliphate, and an empire large and powerful enough to threaten invasion of the Egyptian territory that the Rashidun Caliphate had conquered. Makouria, being in the way between the Empire of Axum and the Rashidun Caliphate, acted as a buffer against invasions, as any invasion by Axum would need to go through Makourian land, and also justify doing an invasion upon a fellow Christian kingdom, as the Axumite Empire was a Christian empire, and the previous kingdom of Meru in the area that had existed in the same place as Makouria had been invaded and more or less slaughtered by the Axum Empire during the reign of King Xana the Great in the 4th century, by the excuse that they were not Christians. But it becomes much harder
to justify invasion
when they are the same religion as the Axumites. And the Caliphate would see an incursion into Makourian land by Axum as a precursor to an invasion of Egyptian land, and thus as an act of aggression, and thus would respond to it. Makouria's function as a buffer state between Axum and the domain of the Caliphate in the north worked both ways, and any expansion down south by Muslim forces would also create a direct border with Axum and probably provoke Axum to take military action before that happened. Not to mention the fact that the kingdom had a large amount of fortifications and positions of defense that would be hard to overcome for either the Islamic Caliphate or the Axum Empire. Castles upon mountains and along the Nile protected the kingdom. Also, the Rashidun and later Umayyads were too busy conquering other places to bother with Makouria, that also protected their exposed south, by Makouria being a relatively weak Christian kingdom that was not an active threat, and that still served an important part as a trade partner and middleman for the slave trade. This power balance and being an important buffer and part of the slave trade lasts throughout the period of the Rashidun and Umayyad periods, and consequently the peace lasts.
And this peaceful state between Makouria and the Islamic Caliphates to the north benefited Makouria greatly, as it not only secured good trading contacts and riches coming from that trade, but also by living in the buffer zone between Axum and the Islamic Caliphates, a sort of independence was possible that previously had not been the case, as earlier kingdoms in the area had been forced to be subservient either to the Axum Empire or to the Roman Empire, as the Eastern Romans had controlled Egypt before the Islamic invasion. This meant that this state of peace and power balance was something of a golden age for the kingdom that now could focus upon its own wealth and development, and take the best of trade and cultural exchange from both the north and the south at the same time. Now, back to the Cultured Jinni and what happens next.
Following the Umayyad control of Egypt, we have the Abbasids that took control of Egypt. And the later Abbasids got more dependent upon the slave trade with entities outside of their domain, as expansionistic wars to expand and get slaves in the process were not as common during the Abbasid period of control of Egypt as it had been during the Umayyad and Rashidun period. It was much more defensive wars during this time, and thus Makouria and Axum in the south become more important to keep good relations with, as they are part of the large slave trade that exists in East Africa. Consequently, the peace lasts, because it's beneficial for the Abbasids to have peace, and the Abbasids don't want to get into conflict with Axum. However, in the 9th to 10th century AD, Axum begins to disappear as a powerful empire, and eventually collapses. Thus, Makuria's function as a buffer state and middleman of trade between Axum and the Islamic world disappears with it. And as we see during the period of the al-Ikhshidiyun, who replaced the Abbasids in the year 935 to 969 AD as the rulers of Egypt, where that both sides of Makuria and the al-Ikhshidiyun began to do small-scale raids against each other. However, Makuria actually managed to expand its territory upwards into Egyptian territory, and the al-Ikhshidiyun did not have the time or resources to do a large-scale counter-invasion before they were replaced by the Shia Fatimid dynasty, who replaced them and quickly made a deal with Makuria to stop mutual hostilities, as the Fatimids were too busy having to convert Muslims to their Shia sect and to fight against other Muslim political entities to bother with Makuria, and thus the place remained untouched by Fatimid aggression. Makuria was also an important ally to the Fatimids in a way, as they still did send slaves. Though not as many as they had done previously, they did send some slaves that they had taken in raids that they had done down south. With the Axumite Empire gone, they could now expand downwards and get slaves that they would sell to the Fatimids. And these slaves actually made up a part of the Fatimid army as slave soldiers, used in the various campaigns of the Fatimids against their enemies, as they tried to secure the supremacy of their sect of Islam against various Sunni political entities. However, once the Shia Fatimids were replaced by the Sunni Ayyubid dynasty and later the Mamluks, raids and later full-scale war would begin again, making the end of the peace that had lasted 6 centuries almost, as these political entities did not have the same pressures that prevented them from invading Makuria. And the Makurian kingdom collapsed in the 13th century due to external invasions. The kingdom ended together with the end of one of the longest recorded, agreed upon periods of peace in human history. As always, feel free to comment on this video if you have any questions or comments upon this very long-lasting peace, and or the various caliphates and the kingdom of Makuria. And on the subject of the Makurian kingdom, if you want to know more about the Makurian kingdom, you should go to the Ghost Countries channel and their video. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.